By 1942, the German security apparatus in occupied France had become brutally efficient. Resistance networks were being rolled up one by one. Radio operators were captured within weeks. Safe houses collapsed overnight. The Gestapo prided itself on methodical counterintelligence, believing that no clandestine network could survive sustained pressure. Yet amid this tightening net, one Allied agent continued to operate undetected, maintaining contact with London while others vanished. Her name appeared repeatedly in German reports, always followed by the same frustration: she could not be found. That agent was Virginia Hall, an American working for Britain's Special Operations Executive. To the Germans, she was not immediately remarkable. She did not fit the profile of a master spy. She was not glamorous, did not cultivate attention, and avoided dramatic gestures. What made her dangerous was not audacity, but consistency. While other networks collapsed under pressure, Hall's continued to function. Messages kept flowing. Sabotage operations remained coordinated. Arrests failed to reach her. The Gestapo did not initially understand why. Their investigations assumed centralized leadership, rigid command structures, and predictable communication patterns. Hall operated differently. She compartmentalized ruthlessly, limiting what any single contact knew. She changed routines constantly, never using the same route or meeting place twice if she could avoid it. Radios were moved frequently, transmissions kept short, and contacts spaced widely apart. This made her network resilient. When one link broke, the rest did not collapse. German counterintelligence soon realized they were facing something unusual. Surveillance reports described a female agent who moved across occupied France with apparent ease, organizing supply drops, coordinating resistance cells, and arranging escapes for downed Allied airmen. She was always one step ahead of arrests. Informants pointed in conflicting directions. Every lead went cold. In internal communications, frustration mounted. The Gestapo was accustomed to breaking networks through fear and infiltration. Hall's operations resisted both. What the Germans did not know, but would soon learn, was that Hall was operating with a severe physical limitation. Years earlier, in a hunting accident, she had lost part of her lower leg. She walked with a prosthetic limb. In theory, this should have made clandestine work impossible. In practice, it made her more careful, more disciplined, and less visible. She avoided situations that required haste. She planned meticulously, and she used her apparent vulnerability as camouflage. No one expected a woman with a limp to be the backbone of a major resistance network. As the months passed, Gestapo files began to refer to an unidentified Allied agent by reputation rather than name. She was described as resourceful, elusive, and unusually effective. Arrests continued elsewhere, but her network persisted. Saboteurs struck rail lines, arms were distributed, airmen were moved south. Every successful operation deepened German concern. Someone was coordinating this activity, someone who understood how the Gestapo hunted. By late 1942, the situation had escalated. Orders were issued to prioritize the capture of the unknown agent. Surveillance intensified. Informers were paid generously. Raids increased in frequency. Yet Hall remained free. She adapted faster than the Germans could adjust. When arrests occurred nearby, she vanished. When safe houses were compromised, she had already moved on. Her survival was not luck. It was method. For the Gestapo, this was intolerable. Their system depended on inevitability. Networks were meant to collapse. Resistance was meant to be temporary. Hall represented a failure of that system, a contradiction they could not explain. And contradictions, in a security organization built on control, are dangerous. The hunt for Virginia Hall had begun in earnest. The Germans would soon give her a name that reflected both fear and grudging respect. They would call her the most dangerous Allied spy in France. They still had no idea how close she was to slipping away. By early 1943, the situation for Allied agents in France had deteriorated rapidly. The Gestapo was no longer dismantling resistance networks slowly. It was tearing them apart with speed and precision. Radio operators were identified within days. Couriers disappeared without warning. Entire cells collapsed overnight after a single arrest. What had once been a fragmented counterintelligence effort hardened into a coordinated hunt. Virginia Hall understood what this meant. The margin for error had vanished. Her network was under constant pressure. Arrests were no longer isolated incidents, they were signals. Each disappearance suggested that surveillance had penetrated deeper than before. Hall responded by shrinking her footprint. She reduced contact, cut transmission times to seconds, and temporarily suspended operations that risked exposure. Weapons drops were delayed. Sabotage missions postponed. Survival became the priority, not momentum. This restraint frustrated London, but it kept the network alive. The Gestapo, meanwhile, was closing in. Interrogations of captured resistance members revealed fragments of a larger structure, always pointing toward an unseen coordinator. Descriptions were inconsistent, but a pattern emerged. The agent was female. She moved constantly. She avoided direct contact, and she was responsible for a disproportionate number of successful operations. German officers began to suspect that this single individual was the connective tissue holding multiple resistance cells together. Surveillance intensified around known safe houses and supply routes. Informants were embedded in cafes, train stations, and markets. Travel documents were scrutinized more aggressively. Hall felt the pressure immediately. She noticed familiar faces appearing too often. Routes that had once been safe felt exposed. Meetings were canceled at the last moment. She began sleeping in different locations every night, carrying only what she could move quickly. The prosthetic leg that limited her mobility also forced her to plan every movement in advance. There would be no running if she made a mistake. The breaking point came when several key resistance leaders were arrested in rapid succession. Under torture, some spoke. Others held out. Either way, the damage was severe. Hall realized that her continued presence in France endangered anyone still connected to her. The Gestapo had narrowed its focus. She was no longer just another agent. She was the objective. German files began referring to a mysterious Allied operative by nickname rather than identity. She was described as the most effective agent operating in occupied territory. Orders were issued to capture her at all costs. Roadblocks increased. Border crossings were watched closely. For Hall, the reality was clear. Staying meant eventual capture, and capture in her line of work meant torture, interrogation, and execution. Escape was the only option, but escape under these conditions bordered on impossible. She was deep inside occupied territory. She was known to be active, and she carried a physical disability that made long-distance travel slow and dangerous. Conventional escape routes had already been compromised. Guides had been arrested. Safe paths were under surveillance. Yet Hall chose the most difficult route available. She would walk out. The plan was brutally simple. She would cross the Pyrenees on foot in winter, moving from occupied France into neutral Spain. The journey would take days, possibly weeks. The terrain was unforgiving, the weather deadly, and the Gestapo was actively searching for her. Failure meant capture at the border or death in the mountains. There was no backup plan. As she prepared to leave, Hall sent one final message to London, informing them of her intent. The response she received was blunt. The mountains were too dangerous. Her physical condition made the journey unrealistic. She was advised to reconsider. Hall ignored the warning. Remaining in France was no longer an option. Survival now depended on disappearance. With forged papers, minimal supplies, and a guide who might already be compromised, she set out toward the mountains. Each step carried risk. Each village passed could be the last. Behind her, the Gestapo continued to tighten its net, convinced that their most dangerous adversary was finally cornered. They were wrong. The journey into the Pyrenees began quietly, without ceremony or witnesses. Virginia Hall left occupied France with forged papers, minimal supplies, and a guide she could not fully trust. Winter had already settled over the mountains. Snow covered the higher passes. Paths were narrow, steep, and often invisible beneath ice. For an able-bodied traveler, the crossing was dangerous. For Hall, with a prosthetic leg, it bordered on suicidal. Each step was deliberate. The artificial limb chafed constantly, cutting into skin already raw from weeks of movement and stress. Pain was unavoidable. Rest was dangerous. Fires could not be lit. Villages were avoided. At night, temperatures dropped sharply, and the risk of hypothermia became as real as the threat of capture. Hall's pace was slow, but she did not stop. Turning back meant arrest. Stopping meant death. The Gestapo, meanwhile, believed they were closing in. Surveillance reports indicated that the elusive agent had vanished from known locations. Roadblocks were reinforced. Border patrols were alerted. German officers assumed she would attempt an escape using established routes or assistance networks. They did not expect her to walk directly through the mountains in winter. That assumption saved her. The climb took days. Hall fell repeatedly, once badly enough that she feared the leg had failed completely. She adjusted the straps, clenched her jaw, and continued. Food ran low. Water froze in containers. At one point, she was forced to crawl on hands and knees to make progress across an exposed slope. Each movement risked a fall that would end the journey instantly, yet she kept moving, guided more by necessity than confidence. At the border, Spanish authorities detained her briefly. Neutrality did not guarantee safety. Allied agents were sometimes imprisoned or returned. Hall was interrogated, her story questioned, her condition noted. Eventually, diplomatic pressure secured her release. She had crossed out of occupied Europe alive. Behind her, the Gestapo found nothing. No body, no arrest, no conclusion. In German files, the most dangerous Allied spy simply disappeared. For Hall, the escape did not mark the end of her war. It marked a transition. She would return to France later under a new identity, with new methods, and resume work the Gestapo believed they had stopped. But the crossing of the Pyrenees changed everything. It confirmed what German intelligence had failed to grasp from the beginning. Virginia Hall was not dangerous because she was bold. She was dangerous because she was disciplined, patient, and willing to endure what others would not. The Gestapo hunted brilliance, audacity, and recklessness. What they faced instead was persistence. By the time they realized their mistake, she was already gone. For the Gestapo, Virginia Hall's disappearance created a problem they could not solve. There was no arrest record, no execution order, no confession extracted under interrogation. Their most dangerous adversary had simply vanished. German counterintelligence officers assumed the threat was over. Networks were declared neutralized. Attention shifted elsewhere. This assumption would prove costly. After reaching safety, Hall did not withdraw from the war. She returned. Under a new identity, working this time for the American Office of Strategic Services, she re-entered occupied France in 1944. Her methods evolved. Radios were avoided when possible. Couriers were decentralized. Sabotage planning was pushed down to local leaders. The very lessons learned from earlier Gestapo successes were now built into her operations. The enemy never realized that the woman they had failed to capture was once again coordinating resistance activity under their noses. German security services continued to search for the mythical figure they believed responsible for earlier failures. Reports referenced an exceptionally skilled Allied agent, possibly still active, but Hall no longer fit their expectations. She disguised herself as an elderly peasant woman, altered her appearance, and blended into rural life. To the Gestapo, danger looked like ambition, visibility, and arrogance. Hall offered none of these. She survived by being ordinary. By the time Allied forces liberated France, Hall had helped organize sabotage operations that disrupted German troop movements ahead of D-Day, guided resistance units during the retreat, and assisted in intelligence gathering critical to the final phase of the war. The Gestapo never caught her, not because they stopped trying, but because they never truly understood how she operated. After the war, her achievements remained largely unrecognized. Espionage does not lend itself to public celebration. Many records remained classified. Others were deliberately understated. Hall herself avoided attention. She joined the newly formed CIA and worked quietly for decades. There were no memoirs, no public lectures, no attempt to shape her own legend. What makes Virginia Hall's story extraordinary is not that she outwitted the Gestapo once, but that she did so consistently, without spectacle and without being captured. In a war where most agents were eventually arrested or killed, survival itself became proof of effectiveness. The Gestapo called her the most dangerous Allied spy not because of a single operation, but because she represented a failure of their entire system. Her story reminds us that intelligence work is not won through brilliance alone, but through discipline, patience, and an understanding of human behavior. Hall succeeded because she accepted limits, planned around them, and endured what others could not. She did not defeat the Gestapo in a dramatic confrontation. She defeated them by never being where they expected her to be. In the end, the most dangerous Allied spy was not the one who left the biggest trail. She was the one who left almost none at all.